Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Jeffrey Dahmer. Let your mind settle as we journey back to the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It is the night of July 22nd, 1991. The air is thick, a heavy velvet blanket of Midwestern humidity that clings to the skin and slows the breath. The streetlights along North 25th Street flicker with a rhythmic, buzzing hum, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. In the distance, the low rumble of a passing train vibrates through the soles of your feet, a steady pulse against the stillness of the midnight hour. The night is dark, the kind of darkness that feels alive, pressing against the windows of the Oxford apartments. This is where our story begins, in the quiet tension of a summer night that is about to shatter. Imagine the scent of damp asphalt and the faint, sweet smell of summer grass, all swirling together in the moonlight as we approach a moment that changed everything. At approximately 11:30 in the evening, a patrol car glides slowly through the streets. Inside are officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller. The interior of the car is cool, the air conditioning a sharp contrast to the sweltering world outside. Suddenly, their headlights catch a figure stumbling into the road. This is Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man whose heart is hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He is partially clothed, his shirt unbuttoned and fluttering in the warm breeze. But it is his wrist that draws the officer's attention. Hanging from it is a single, silver handcuff. It glints under the yellow street lamps, a cold, metallic weight that clicks softly with every frantic movement he makes. Tracy is gasping for air, his eyes wide, and reflecting the flashing blue and red lights of the cruiser. He tells the officers a story that sounds like a fever dream. He speaks of a man, a knife, and a narrow apartment where the air is too thin to breathe. He points back toward the brick facade of the Oxford apartments, his hand trembling so violently that the dangling metal cuff rings out like a tiny mourning bell in the silence of the street. The officers decide to follow Tracy back to the source of his terror. They walk with him through the heavy glass doors of the building and into the hallway. The carpet beneath their boots is worn and thin, muffled by years of footsteps. As they ascend toward the second floor, the air begins to change. It carries a strange, cloying weight, a mixture of heavy industrial chemicals and something far more ancient and unsettling. They reach the door of apartment 213. The hallway is quiet, save for the distant sound of a television muffled by wood and plaster. Officer Roth knocks. The sound is sharp and final. When the door swings open, they are met by a man who looks entirely unremarkable. Jeffrey is standing there, his sandy hair slightly tousled, his expression one of mild, sleepy confusion. He is wearing a plain shirt and glasses that catch the dim light of the hallway. He speaks softly, his voice a low, steady drone that betrays no panic. He tells the officers that the handcuff was merely a misunderstanding, a joke gone wrong. He invites them inside, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he has all the time in the world. As they step over the threshold of apartment 213, the sensory world narrows. The room is small, cluttered with the remnants of a life lived in the margins. A beige couch sits against one wall, and near it, a large, vintage fish tank hums with a low, mechanical vibration. The water inside is murky, the bubbles rising to the surface in a steady, hypnotic stream. On a black, Art Deco table, objects are scattered in a way that feels both random and meticulously placed. But the smell is what truly defines the space. It is a putrid, sharp odor that stings the back of the throat, smelling of bleach and rot. In the corner of the room stands a large, blue plastic barrel. It looks heavy, its surface dull and opaque. Jeffrey remains calm, his hands resting at his sides. He offers to find the key for the handcuffs, suggesting it might be in the bedroom. The officers watch him, their instincts prickling like static electricity. The apartment feels tight, the walls closing in, every shadow hiding something that the mind is not yet ready to perceive. Officer Mueller follows the path toward the bedroom, his hand resting near his holster. The room is dim, lit only by the spill of light from the main area. He searches for the key, his eyes scanning the surface of a nightstand and a dresser. Underneath a mattress, he glimpses the edge of a large butcher knife, its steel blade reflecting a sliver of light. It is cold and sharp, a silent witness to the fear Tracy Edwards had described. But it is when Mueller opens a drawer that the world truly tilts. Inside, he finds a stack of Polaroid photographs. He picks them up, the glossy paper feeling smooth against his fingertips. As he flips through them, the images reveal themselves in the half-light. They are not the snapshots of a normal life. They are frozen moments of absolute horror, depicting bodies in various stages of mutilation. The colors in the photos are vivid and wrong. Mueller feels the blood drain from his face, the silence of the room suddenly becoming deafening. He walks back into the main room, showing the photos to his partner. The atmosphere in the apartment shifts instantly, the air turning frigid despite the July heat. The moment the photos are revealed, the mask of the unassuming neighbor slips away. Jeffrey sees the images in the officer's hand and he knows. His body tenses, a sudden, sharp realization dawning behind his glasses. A brief struggle ensues, the sound of scuffling boots on the thin carpet breaking the heavy quiet. The officers quickly overpower him, the metallic click of their own handcuffs echoing through the small space. As they lead him away, Jeffrey utters a sentence that would linger in the air long after he was gone. He says, in that same low, flat tone, "For what I did, I should be dead." They lead him out of apartment 213, out of the Oxford apartments, and into the waiting night. Behind them, the door remains slightly ajar, the blue barrel sitting in the shadows and the fish tank continuing its steady, indifferent hum. The city of Milwaukee sleeps on, unaware that the door to one of history's most harrowing chapters has just been forced open. The night of July 22nd ends not with a bang, but with the cold weight of the truth finally coming to light. The heat of June 18, 1978, hung heavy over Bath, Ohio, like a thick, damp wool blanket. The air was stagnant, carrying the scent of cut grass and the sweet, cloying aroma of wild honeysuckle that clung to the edges of the woods. Inside the house on West Bath Road, the silence was absolute. It was a hollow, echoing kind of quiet that follows a storm, though the storm here had been the slow, agonizing dissolution of a family. Jeffrey stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had recently fractured. His mother, Joyce, had left, taking his younger brother with her to Wisconsin. His father, Lionel, was living in a motel nearby, leaving the 18-year-old Jeffrey to drift through the empty rooms alone. The linoleum floors felt cold under his feet, and the refrigerator hummed with a low, mechanical vibration that seemed to be the only heartbeat left in the house. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a vacuum that needed to be filled with something, anything, to ground him in the physical world. He stepped out into the blinding midday sun, the gravel of the driveway crunching sharply under his boots as he walked toward his car, driven by a restless, undefined hunger for companionship that he didn't yet know how to name. As he drove along the winding backroads, the shimmering heat waves rose from the asphalt in translucent ribbons. It was there, on the shoulder of the road, that he saw Stephen Hicks. Stephen was 18 years old, his skin bronzed by the early summer sun, his hair catching the light as he stood with his thumb out, hoping for a ride to the rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park. When Jeffrey pulled over, the sound of the engine idling was the only thing breaking the quiet of the rural landscape. Stephen climbed into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of the outdoors and the easy, unburdened energy of youth. Jeffrey watched him from the corner of his eye as they drove toward the house on West Bath Road. He promised the boy a few beers, a simple invitation that felt harmless in the golden afternoon light. Inside the house, they sat in the living room, the sunlight filtering through the curtains in dusty, golden shafts. They talked, they listened to music, and they drank. But as the shadows lengthened and the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, the atmosphere shifted. Stephen mentioned he needed to get going, that he wanted to reach the concert before dark. That simple desire to leave acted like a spark in the dry brush of Jeffrey's mind. The thought of being left alone again in that echoing, empty house was unbearable. He didn't want the conversation to end. He didn't want the presence of another living soul to vanish back into the Ohio twilight. The violence, when it came, was sudden and heavy. Jeffrey reached for a 10-pound silver dumbbell he had been using for exercise. He struck from behind, the cold metal connecting with a dull, sickening thud as Stephen sat in a chair, unsuspecting. The boy slumped forward, the suddenness of the act swallowing any sound he might have made. In the heavy, suffocating silence that followed, Jeffrey used the bar of that same dumbbell to finish what he had started, strangling the life out of the hitchhiker until the room was once again still. For a long moment, Jeffrey simply stood there, his chest heaving, the only sound the distant chirp of crickets beginning their evening chorus outside the window. He looked down at what he had done, and in that dark, primal space, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of possession. He didn't feel horror so much as a grim, clinical curiosity. He dragged the body down to the basement, the wooden stairs creaking under the weight. The basement was cool and smelled of damp earth and old concrete. There, in the dim light of a single bulb, he began the methodical process of dismantling the evidence of his first crime. He used a carving knife, the blade catching the light as he worked with a focus that was as calm as it was macabre. He was no longer just a lonely teenager. He was a keeper of secrets buried in the foundations of his childhood home. The cleanup was a labor of days, a secret ritual performed under the cover of night. He buried the remains in a shallow grave in the backyard, but the fear of discovery gnawed at him. A few weeks later, he unearthed the body, his hands stained by the dark Ohio soil. He brought the remains back to the basement, where he used acid to dissolve the flesh, watching as the chemical reaction hissed and bubbled in the quiet of the night. The bones that remained were different. They were stubborn and white. He took a sledgehammer, and with rhythmic, heavy blows, he pulverized them into tiny, unrecognizable fragments. He walked out into the 1.7-acre wooded area behind the house, the ground soft with decaying leaves and pine needles. He scattered the bone dust among the trees, letting the wind carry the last traces of Stephen Hicks into the undergrowth. He even took the boy's necklace and threw it from the West Bath Road Bridge into the murky waters of the Cuyahoga River, watching it sink into the silt. For a moment, it seemed as if the earth had simply swallowed the young man whole, leaving no ripple in the surface of the world. Jeffrey returned to the house, scrubbed the floors, and waited. He waited for the police to knock, for the neighbors to notice, for the sky to fall. But the knock never came. The world continued to turn, and the silence returned to the house, deeper and more profound than before. The years that followed were a long, drifting fog of isolation and repressed memory. Jeffrey joined the army and was stationed in Germany, where he spent his days as a medic, and his nights drowning his thoughts in cheap schnapps and beer. He was eventually discharged for his chronic drinking, a quiet failure that sent him back to the United States. He drifted through Miami, sleeping on beaches, before finally ending up in West Allis, Wisconsin, at the home of his grandmother, Catherine. The house was modest, filled with the smell of home-cooked meals and the gentle ticking of clocks. To Catherine, he was just her quiet, troubled grandson who needed a place to stay and a chance to get his life together. He found a job at a chocolate factory, working the night shift, surrounded by the sweet, heavy scent of cocoa and the rhythmic churning of industrial mixers. For 9 long years, the darkness remained dormant, a hibernating beast coiled at the base of his spine. He lived a life of unremarkable routines, his true nature hidden behind a mask of polite, stammering awkwardness. But the memory of that summer in 1978 never truly left him. It was a foundation, a proof of concept that lived in the back of his mind. As the late 1980s approached, the isolation of his grandmother's basement began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, and the quiet of Milwaukee was about to be broken by a hunger that had only been sleeping. The fog of Germany and the quiet, strained years at his grandmother's house finally gave way to a new chapter in May of 1990. He packed his few belongings, including a dark and heavy secret tucked away in a trunk, and moved into the Oxford apartments at 924 North 25th Street. Room 213 was a small, unassuming one-bedroom space on the second floor, costing him only $300 a month. As he turned the key for the first time, the hallway light flickered with a low, rhythmic hum, casting long, skeletal shadows against the beige wallpaper. The air inside the apartment was still and heavy, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old pipes and the dust of previous tenants. To anyone else, it was a simple, economical home near the chocolate factory where he worked the night shift. But to him, it was a sanctuary where the boundaries of the world could finally be dismantled. He placed his vintage fish tank against the wall, its charcoal filter bubbling softly, a sound that would soon be joined by much darker rhythms behind those thin, plaster walls. By the summer of 1990, the atmosphere within room 213 began to change. The heat of Milwaukee pressed against the windows, and the poor ventilation of the building trapped every scent and sound. It wasn't long before a cloying, putrid odor began to seep through the door frame and into the shared corridor. It was a smell that sat on the back of the tongue, thick, sweet, and undeniably wrong. When the building manager, Sopa Princewell, or the concerned neighbors would knock, he was always ready with a polite, soft-spoken excuse. He told them his deep freezer had broken, and a large supply of venison had spoiled in the summer heat. On other days, he would point to the large aquarium, claiming a few of his tropical fish had died, and he hadn't yet had the heart to clear them out. To mask the growing heaviness in the air, he used a relentless amount of industrial bleach and chemical cleaners. The scent of pine and chlorine fought against the underlying decay, creating a sharp, stinging bouquet that made the eyes of passers-by water as they hurried to their own doors, never imagining the source of the rot. As 1990 turned into 1991, the frequency of his trips to the local bars increased. He would return in the late hours, often accompanied by young men lured by the promise of $50 for a few photographs or a simple drink. Inside the apartment, the blue flickering light of his small television was the only illumination. He watched the film The Exorcist 3 over and over, mesmerized by the themes of possession and control. The neighbors began to hear more than just the television. There were heavy thumps in the middle of the night, the sound of something weightier than a falling book hitting the floor. Then came the mechanical whirring, the high-pitched buzz of a circular saw vibrating through the floorboards at 3 in the morning. When confronted, he would simply apologize, blaming his late-night woodworking hobbies or his erratic work schedule at the factory. His politeness was a shield, a dull beige mask that deflected the growing suspicions of those living just inches away. They saw a quiet, lonely man, perhaps a bit odd, but fundamentally harmless, while inside, the one-bedroom apartment was transforming into a clinical, claustrophobic laboratory of the macabre. The most vigilant observer was Glenda Cleveland, who lived in the building adjacent and whose daughter and niece often spent time in the area. She felt the darkness of room 213 in her bones. In May of 1991, a particularly chilling event occurred that should have broken the silence. A 14-year-old boy named Conrack was found wandering the street outside, dazed and bleeding, having escaped the second-floor apartment. Glenda and her family called the police, desperate to help the child who could barely speak. But when the officers arrived, he appeared calm and articulate. He convinced the authorities that the boy was his 19-year-old lover and that they had simply had a domestic dispute fueled by too much alcohol. Despite Glenda's frantic protests that the boy was clearly a child, the officers escorted the boy back into room 213. The heavy door clicked shut, the locks turned, and the silence returned to the hallway. It was a moment where the veil nearly lifted, only to be pulled back down by a society that preferred to look away from the uncomfortable truths hiding in plain sight. By the final months of his residence, the apartment had become a labyrinth of horrors. A large, blue 55-gallon drum sat in the corner of the bedroom, its plastic surface cold to the touch, containing a silent, corrosive solution. The refrigerator, once a place for simple groceries, now held items that no human eye should ever see. He had begun to create an altar, a dark monument to his isolation, using the remains he had meticulously preserved. The walls of room 213 seemed to pulse with the weight of the 12 lives taken within its confines. Every night, the buzzing of the saw and the scent of chemicals continued, a rhythmic, haunting lullaby that the other tenants tried to ignore. They complained about the heat, the noise, and the persistent, oily smell that clung to their clothes, never realizing they were living on the periphery of a nightmare. He remained the quiet neighbor, the man who worked at the chocolate factory, while the apartment itself became a tomb sealed tight against the world, waiting for the one mistake that would finally shatter the quiet and reveal the shadows within. The heavy, stagnant air of apartment 213 was a world away from the cooling concrete of the Milwaukee streets on that late May night in 1991. Outside, the world was breathing. A soft, humid breeze carried the scent of exhaust and distant rain, rustling the leaves of the few trees that clung to life along North 25th Street. It was shortly before 2 in the morning when the shadows of the Oxford apartments shifted, and a small, fragile figure emerged into the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. This was Conrack Synthesomphone. He was only 14 years old, though in the hazy, orange-tinted darkness, he looked even younger, his small frame trembling against the chill of the night. He was naked, his skin slick with a cold sweat, and his movements were not those of a boy running for his life, but of a ghost wandering through a dream. The drugs coursing through his system made the world tilt and spin. Every step on the rough asphalt was a labor of monumental effort. He was bleeding, a slow trail of red marking his escape from the labyrinth he had just left behind. He could not speak. His voice was trapped behind a wall of chemical fog, leaving him to stagger toward the intersection of 25th and State, a silent plea for mercy written in the very way his body slumped toward the ground. Nearby, 2 young women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, were standing in the quiet of the night when they saw the impossible. They saw a child, dazed and broken, stumbling into the light. Their hearts hammered against their ribs as they rushed toward him, their voices filled with the urgent, high-pitched frequency of genuine alarm. They reached out to him, their hands hovering just inches away, afraid to touch the wounds they could see gleaming under the street lamps. They tried to ask him his name, to ask what had happened, but Conrack could only offer a hollow, distant stare. His eyes were wide, reflecting the neon signs of the city, but they saw nothing. Nicole ran to a nearby phone booth, her fingers shaking as she dialed those 3 life-saving digits, her voice cracking as she told the dispatcher that there was a boy, a child, who had been beaten and was wandering the streets without a stitch of clothing. She stayed on the line, her eyes fixed on the boy, while Sandra stayed by his side, trying to shield him from the eyes of the world, unaware that the shadow he had escaped was already closing in once again. The pavement felt cold beneath them, the silence of the neighborhood suddenly feeling heavy and expectant, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if the light would finally find its way into the darkness. Then, out of the gloom, came the man. Jeffrey stepped into the circle of light with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream. He did not run. He did not look panicked. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his voice soft and soothing as he approached the small group. He looked at the women and offered a tired, knowing smile, the kind of smile a man might give when explaining away a minor embarrassment. He told them that the boy was his friend, a 19-year-old guest who had simply had too much to drink. He called him by a different name, a name that didn't belong to the boy on the ground. The contrast was stark. The two women, frantic and desperate to help, and the tall, blonde man, projecting an aura of middle-class stability and mundane concern. When the police cruiser finally pulled up, its blue and red lights dancing off the brick walls of the apartment complex, the air changed. The authority of the law had arrived. Officers John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish stepped out, their heavy boots clicking on the pavement. They did not see a victim. They did not see the terror in the boy's unblinking eyes or the blood that the women pointed out with trembling fingers. They saw what Jeffrey wanted them to see. They saw a domestic dispute, a messy, private moment that they found distasteful and beneath their station. The smell of the street, a mix of damp earth and city grime, filled their lungs as they listened to the killer's lies, his voice steady, his eyes never wavering. The neighbors pleaded. They shouted that the boy was a child, that he was hurt, that he needed a hospital, not a return to the room he had just fled. But their voices were treated as noise, dismissed by the officers who shared a joke with the man in the glasses. The power dynamic was absolute. The officers chose to believe the soft-spoken white man over the frantic testimonies of the black women standing on the corner. They even walked with Jeffrey and Conrack back toward the building, their presence acting as an escort for a predator. As they entered the hallway of the Oxford apartments, the smell changed. The fresh night air was replaced by the cloying, sweet rot that had begun to seep through the doors of apartment 213. The officers noticed it, even commented on it, but Jeffrey was ready. He blamed the smell on a broken refrigerator, a simple household mishap. He was so convincing, so ordinary, that the officers didn't even bother to look around the room where the remains of others were hidden in the shadows. They stood in the very space where the boy's fate would be sealed, their leather belts creaking as they turned to leave. They left the 14-year-old boy in the hands of the man who had already begun to destroy him. The heavy wooden door of the apartment swung shut with a dull, final thud, the sound echoing through the empty hallway like a gavel. The light had flickered for a moment, illuminating the truth, but then it was extinguished, leaving the hallway in a darkness deeper than the night outside. 30 minutes later, the silence in apartment 213 was absolute. The city outside continued its slow crawl toward dawn, the streetlights still humming, the neighbors still haunted by what they had seen. But inside, the failure of light was complete. The tragedy of Conrack Synthesomphone was not just in the actions of the man who took his life, but in the hands that pushed him back into the fire. It was a moment where the system, designed to protect the vulnerable, looked at a child in agony and saw nothing but a nuisance. The textures of that night, the cold asphalt, the rough fabric of a neighbor's coat, the polished metal of a badge all became part of a larger, darker tapestry. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch longer, reaching out to swallow the memory of the boy who had almost made it to safety. As the sun began to rise over Milwaukee, casting long, pale fingers across the skyline, the windows of the Oxford apartments remained dark, hiding the chilling reality of what had occurred in the wake of the police's departure. The opportunity to stop the horror had passed, slipping through the fingers of the law like sand. The weight of that missed chance would hang over the city for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things are not the monsters we imagine, but the indifference of the world that allows them to exist. The apartment sat quiet, a tomb of secrets, as the first light of morning failed to touch the horrors resting within those four walls. The air in the narrow hallway of the Oxford apartments was thick and stagnant on that Monday night in July of 1991. Officers Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller moved with a cautious, rhythmic heavy-footedness that echoed against the peeling, floral-patterned wallpaper. Beside them, Tracy Edwards, a man who had narrowly escaped a nightmare, was trembling, his breathing shallow and jagged as he clutched a pair of handcuffs that hung loosely from one wrist. When they reached the door of apartment 213, the silence from within felt less like peace and more like a held breath, a suspension of reality. Jeffrey opened the door with a calm that was almost offensive in its normalcy. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply stood there, a tall, nondescript man with straw-colored hair and glasses that caught the dim light of the hallway. The interior of the apartment was deceptively ordinary at first glance: a beige sofa, a television, and a large fish tank where tropical fish drifted in slow, uncaring circles. But as the officers crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. There was a scent, faint but persistent, a mixture of heavy chemicals and something sweet and cloying that clawed at the back of the throat. It was the smell of a place where life had been systematically unmade, masked by the hum of an air conditioner that struggled against the Wisconsin heat. Officer Mueller's hand moved toward the bedside table in the cramped bedroom, searching for the key to the metal restraints still binding Tracy's arm. As he pulled the drawer open, the mundane world of apartment living dissolved into something unrecognizable. Inside, he didn't find keys or loose change. Instead, his eyes met a stack of glossy Polaroid photographs. The images were not of family or vacations, but of a quiet, calculated horror, bodies in various states of undress and dismemberment, posed against the very furniture they were standing next to. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against the officers' chests. While Mueller called for backup, his voice crackling over the radio, Roth moved toward the kitchen. The linoleum was clean, the counters clear of clutter. He reached for the handle of the white refrigerator, a motion so common it should have been meaningless. But when the door swung open, the pale light from inside illuminated a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There, resting on a shelf alongside a carton of milk and a jar of mustard, was a human head. It was the moment the reality of apartment 213 revealed itself, not as a home, but as a carefully maintained tomb. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the quiet residential street was swallowed by the strobing blue and red lights of the Milwaukee Police Department. Homicide detectives Michael Dubas and Patrick Kennedy arrived to find a scene that defied any previous experience in their long careers. The forensic search began with a slow, agonizing precision. Every inch of the small space was a layer of a dark puzzle. In the bedroom, they discovered a filing cabinet that held more than just paperwork. Inside its metal drawers, nestled among files, they found skeletal remains and preserved organs. The investigators worked in a hushed, reverent focus, the only sound being the mechanical click and whine of forensic cameras capturing the evidence. On the shelves, they found 7 human skulls. 3 of them had been painted with a textured gray paint, turned into macabre ornaments that sat alongside a King James Bible. The detectives felt the grit of the carpet under their boots, knowing that beneath the fibers lay secrets the killer had tried to scrub away with industrial bleach and persistence. They moved with latex-covered hands, cataloging the tools of the trade: the saws, the knives, and the hammers, each one a cold testament to the violence that had occurred in the middle of this bustling city. The most imposing object in the room was a large 57-gallon blue plastic drum standing in the corner like a silent, ominous sentry. It was heavy, sealed with a thick lid, and emitted a chemical odor sharp enough to sting the eyes of the investigators. This was the vessel of the unthinkable, a vat where 3 torsos had been placed in a bath of corrosive muriatic acid. When the forensic team finally moved to transport it, the liquid inside sloshed with a heavy, dull sound that echoed through the empty apartment. The physical weight of the evidence was staggering. They found a kettle on the stove that contained parts of a human body, a detail so domestic, and yet so depraved it caused even the most seasoned officers to turn away. In the freezer, wrapped in plastic bags as if they were simple groceries, were more remains, a heart, and muscle fillets. The contrast between the clinical, organized nature of the apartment and the carnage hidden within the drawers and appliances was a psychic blow to everyone present. The light of the flashbulbs illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, oblivious to the fact that they were settling on the remains of 11 different lives. The removal of the remains was a process that lasted through the long night and into the following days. The blue drum was eventually wheeled out on a metal dolly, its weight causing the small wheels to groan and protest against the pavement. Neighbors gathered behind the yellow police tape, watching in a stunned, mournful silence as the boxes were carried out. Each box was a fragment of a person, a life reduced to a numbered piece of evidence to be analyzed in a lab. The specialized cleanup required more than just standard sanitation. It required the systematic stripping of the apartment's history. The blood-stained mattress was dragged out, its deep, dark stains exposed to the moonlight. The carpet was ripped from the floor, revealing the bare wood beneath. Even after the furniture was gone and the walls were scrubbed, the energy of the space remained heavy and distorted. The forensic search had concluded, and the man who had called this place home was now in a cell, but the void left behind was vast. As the sun began to rise over Milwaukee on the morning of July 23rd, the shadows of North 25th Street had finally been dragged into the unblinking, merciless light of day, leaving a scar on the building that no amount of cleaning could ever truly heal. In the heart of a cold Wisconsin February, the air in Milwaukee felt brittle, like thin ice about to crack under the weight of the world's gaze. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick, a heavy blanket of collective breath and whispered prayers that seemed to press against the high, wood-paneled walls. The year was 1992, and the trial had become a theater of shared trauma. Behind a thick partition of reinforced glass sat the man who had haunted the city's dreams. He looked remarkably ordinary in his spectacles and suit, a quiet figure who had spent the last several weeks listening to the clinical descriptions of his own depravity. The light from the overhead fluorescent fixtures hummed with a low electric vibration, casting long, pale shadows across the scuffed linoleum floors. Every time a door opened, a draft of winter air would slip in, carrying the scent of salt and exhaust from the streets outside, reminding everyone that while justice was being sought inside these walls, the world outside was still turning, oblivious and scarred. The tension reached a breaking point during the victim impact statements. This was the moment when the abstract nature of the law met the raw, unyielding reality of grief. One by one, the families stood. You could hear the soft rustle of their clothes, the sharp intake of breath before they spoke. Shirley Hughes, the mother of Tony Hughes, read a poem that hung in the air like a lament, her voice a fragile thread of strength. But the silence was truly shattered when Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, took her place at the podium. She did not look at the notes in her hand. Her grief was not a thing of paper and ink, it was a physical force. As she began to speak, her voice climbed an octave, vibrating with a frequency of pure, unfiltered pain. She called him a monster, her shouts distorting the microphones, the sound echoing off the ceiling like a thunderclap in a small room. When she lunged toward the glass, her feet pounding against the carpeted floor, it took 4 court officers to restrain her. The room was no longer a place of order. It was a cathedral of rage. And for a fleeting moment, the man behind the glass seemed to shrink, the weight of 1,000 sins finally beginning to settle on his shoulders. The sentence was a tally of lifetimes. 15 consecutive life terms, a number so large it felt more like a concept than a reality. Judge Lawrence Graham spoke the words with a solemn finality, the sound of his gavel striking the wooden block echoing like a heartbeat. Shortly after, A 16th term was added for the murder in Ohio, ensuring that the doors of the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage would never open for him again. The prison was a fortress of gray stone and steel, sitting amidst the flat, desolate landscape of central Wisconsin. Inside, the world narrowed to the width of a cell and the length of a hallway. The air here was different. It smelled of floor wax, industrial bleach, and the stagnant stillness of men who are waiting for nothing. For 2 years, he moved through these corridors like a ghost, a high-profile shadow kept in protective custody. He spent his hours reading the Bible, corresponding with strangers, and perhaps, in the quiet of the night, listening to the drip of a leaky faucet or the distant, rhythmic clanging of a guard's keys against the bars. Then came the morning of November 28, 1994. It was a Monday, and the sun was likely struggling to break through the thick, leaden clouds that often hang over Wisconsin in late autumn. He was assigned to a work detail, a mundane task of cleaning the gymnasium and the showers. There were 3 of them left unsupervised for a brief window of time. The tiles in the shower room were slick with soapy water, the air damp and humid. Among them was Christopher Scarver, a man who believed he was an instrument of divine retribution. In the heavy, echoing silence of the locker room, the routine was shattered. Scarver had retrieved a 20-inch metal bar from a piece of exercise equipment. There were no witnesses to the words exchanged, only the sudden, violent sounds of metal meeting bone. The struggle was brief. When the guards finally returned, they found the man who had caused so much terror lying on the wet floor, his life leaking out into the drain. He died shortly after, the final chapter of his story written in a dark corner of a prison gym. In the years that followed, the physical remnants of the tragedy were systematically erased. The apartment building on North 25th Street was razed to the ground, leaving behind a vacant lot where the grass grew tall and wild, masking the scars on the land. But a landscape can be cleared more easily than a memory. The names of the 17 victims, the sons, brothers, and friends, remain etched in the history of the city, a testament to lives that were full of potential before they were stolen. We look back at these events not to dwell on the darkness, but to honor the light that was lost. The questions of how and why still linger in the corners of the mind, drifting like smoke in the moonlight, but the answers are no longer needed for us to find peace. The story has reached its natural end, and the echoes of the past are finally growing faint in the cool night air. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.